Aside from being unable to stand, I had two other very serious problems. First was the total loss of my pants. They had been blown right off me. The second was the condition of my left leg, which I could scarcely feel, but which was a horrific sight, bleeding profusely and full of shrapnel. I had no bandages, nothing medical. I had been able to do nothing for my teammates, and I could do nothing for myself except try to stay hidden. It was not a promising situation, and I was damn sure I had broken my back and probably my shoulder. I had a broken nose, and my face was a total mess. I couldn't stand up, never mind walk, and at least one leg was wrecked and maybe the other. I was paralyzed in both thighs, and the only way I could move was to belly crawl. Unsurprisingly, I was dazed, and through my personal fog of war there was one more miracle for me to recognize. Not 2 feet from where I was lying, half hidden by dirt and shale, well out of sight of my enemy, was my Mark 12 rifle, and I still had 1.5 magazines left. I prayed before I grabbed it, because I thought it might be just a mirage, and that when I tried to hold it, well, it just might disappear. But it did not, and I felt the cold steel in the hot air as my fingers clasped it. I listened again for his voice. I prayed again, imploring him for guidance. But there was no sound, and all I knew that was somehow I had to make it out to the right, where I'd be safe, at least for a while. My God had not spoken again, but neither had he forsaken me, and I knew that, for damn sure I knew that. I knew other things as well. For the first time, I was entirely alone. Here, in these Taliban-controlled, hostile mountains, there was no earthly teammate for me, and my enemy was all around. Had they heeded the words of the goatherds, that there were four of us, and right now that they only had three bodies? Or did they assume I had been blown to pieces by the final blast of the final Russian RPG? I had no answer to those questions, only hope. With absolutely no one to turn to, no Mikey, no Axe, no Danny, I had to face the final battle by myself, maybe lonely, maybe desolate, maybe against formidable odds, but I was not giving up. I had only one teammate, and he moved, as ever, in mysterious ways. But I was a Christian, and he had somehow saved me from 1,000 AK-747 bullets on this day. No one had shot me, which was well nigh beyond all comprehension. And I still believed he did not wish me to die, and I would still try my best to uphold the honor of the United States Navy SEALs, as I imagined they would have wished. No surrender. Fuck that. When I judged I had fully gathered my senses and checked my watch, it was exactly 13:42 local time. For a few minutes there was no gunfire, and I was beginning to assume they thought I was dead. Wrong, Marcus. The Taliban AK-47s opened up again, and suddenly there was bullets flying everywhere, all around, just like before. My enemy was coming up on me from the lower levels from both sides, firing rapidly but inaccurately. Their bullets were ripping into the earth and shale across a wide range, most of them, thank Christ, well away from me. It was clear they thought I might be still alive, but equally clear they had not yet located me. They were conducting a kind of recon by fire, trying to flush me out, blazing away across the spectrum, hoping someone would finally hit me and finish me, or better yet, that I would come out with my hand so high the murdering little bastards could cut off my head or indulge in one of their other little attractive other attractive little idiosyncrasies before telling that evil little television station Al Jazeera how they had conquered the infidels. I think I've mentioned my view about surrender. I rammed another magazine into the breech of my miraculous rifle and somehow crawled over this little hill, through the hail of bullets, right into the side of the mountain. No one saw me, no one hit me. I wedged myself into a rocky crevice with my legs sticking out into a clump of bushes. There were huge rocks on both sides protecting me. Overall, I judge I was jammed into a 15-foot wide ledge on a mountain. It was not a cave, not even a shallow cave, because it was kind of open top, way above me. Rocks and sand kept falling down on me as the Taliban warriors scrambled around above my position. But this crevice provided sensational cover and camouflage. Even I realized I would be pretty hard to spot. They'd have had to get real lucky, even with their latest little policy of trying to flush me out by sheer volume of fire. My line of vision was directly ahead. I realized I couldn't move or change positions, at least in broad daylight I couldn't, and that it was imperative that I hide the blood from which was leaking from my battered body. I took stock of my injuries. My left leg was still bleeding pretty bad, and I packed the wounds with mud. I had a big cut on my forehead, which I also packed with mud. Both legs were numb, and I was not going anywhere, at least not for a while. I had no medical kit, no map, no compass. I had my bullets and I had my gun, and I had a decent view of my mountain, straight ahead over the canyon to the next mountain. I had no pants and no buddies, but no one could see me. I was wedged in tight, my back to the wall in every possible sense. I eased myself into a relatively comfortable position, checked my rifle, and laid it down the length of my body, aiming outward. And even if they discovered me, I guess I'd quickly be joining Mikey or Danny, Axe, and Mikey, but not before I'd kill a whole lot of them. I knew, in perfect position for a stubborn defensive military action, protected on all sides, vulnerable to a frontal assault only, and that would have to be by weight of numbers. Sorry. I could still hear gunfire, and it was growing closer. They were definitely coming this way, and I thought, don't move, don't breathe, don't make a sound. I think it was about then when I understood how utterly alone I was for the first time, and that the Taliban were hunting me. They were not hunting for a SEAL platoon, they were hunting me alone. Despite my injuries, I knew I had to reach deep. I was starting to lose track of time, but I stayed still, and I actually did not move 1 inch for 8 hours. As time passed, I could see the Taliban guys right across the canyon, running up and down. Seems like hundreds of them, plainly searching, scouring the mountain they knew so well, looking for me. And I had some feeling back in my legs, but the bleeding was real bad, and I was in a lot of pain. I think the loss of blood may have started to make me feel lightheaded. Also, I was scared to death. It was the first time in my entire 6 year career as a Navy SEAL I had been really scared. At one point, late in the afternoon, I thought they were all leaving across the canyon, the mountainside clear, everyone running hard to the right, swarms of them headed for the same place. At least that's how it seemed to me across my narrow field of vision. I now know where they were going. While I was lying there in my crevice, I had no idea what the hell was going on, but now I shall recount, by the best of my gathered knowledge, what happened elsewhere on that saddest afternoons, the most shocking massacre high in the Hindu Kush, the worst disaster ever to befall the SEALs in any conflict in our more than 40-year history. The first thing to remember is that Mikey had succeeded in getting through the Quick Reaction Force, QRF, in Asadabad, a couple mountain ranges over from where I was still holding out. That last call, the one on his cell phone that essentially cost him his life, was successful. From all accounts, his haunting words, "My guys are dying out here. We need help," ripped around the base like a flash fire. "SEALs are dying." That's a 5 alarm emergency that stops only just north on the side of Frenzy. Lieutenant Commander Christensen, our acting CO, sounded the alarm. It's always a decision for the QRF to launch or not launch. Eric took a billionth of a second to make it. I know the vision of us four, his buddies, his friends and teammates, Mikey, Axe, Danny, and me, fighting for our lives, hurt, possibly dead, surrounded by a huge fighting force of bloodthirsty Afghan tribesmen, flashed through his mind as he summoned the boys to action stations. And the vision of this terrible loss stood stark before him as he roared down the phone, ordering the men of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, SOAR, the fabled Night Stalkers, to bring the big Army MH-47 Helo ready, right there on the runway. It was the same one that had taken off just before us on the previous day, the one we trekked in to our ops area. Guys, I've already introduced charge into position, desperate to help, cramming as much ammunition as they could into their pouches, grabbing rifles and running for the Chinook, its rotors already screaming. My SDV Team 1 guys were instantly there. Petty Officer James Shaw and Shane Patton reached the helo first. Then, scrambling abroad, came the massively built Senior Chief Dan Healy, the man who had masterminded Operation Red Wing, who apparently looked as if he had been shot as he left the barracks. Then came the SEAL Team 10 guys, Lieutenant Mike McGreevy Jr. of New York, Chief Jacques Fontaine of New Orleans, Petty Officer First Class Jeff Lucas from Oregon, and Jeff Taylor from West Virginia. Finally, still shouting that the boys needed every gun they could get, came Lieutenant Commander Eric Christensen, the man who knew perhaps better than anyone that 8 SEALs in a helo were about to risk a lethal daytime insertion in a high mountain pass right into the jaws of an enemy that might outnumber them dozens to one. Christensen knew he did not have to go. In fact, perhaps he should not have gone, stayed instead at his post, central to control and command. Right then, we had the skipper in the QRF, which was, at best, a bit unorthodox. But Eric Christensen was a SEAL to his fingertips, and what he knew, above all else, was that he had just heard a desperate cry for help, from his brothers, from a man he knew well and trusted. There was no way Eric was not going to answer that call. Nothing on God's earth would have persuaded him not to go. He must have known we were barely holding on, praying for help to arrive. There were, after all, only 4 of us, and to everyone's certain knowledge, there was a minimum of 100 Taliban. Eric understood the stupendous nature of the risk, and he never blinked, just grabbed his rifle and ammunition and raced to board the aircraft, yelling at everyone else to hurry. Move it, guys. Let's really move. That's what he always said under pressure. Sure, he was a commanding officer, and a hell of a good one. But more than that, he was a SEAL, a part of a brotherhood forged in blood. Even more important, he was a man. And right now, he was answering an urgent, desperate crying from the very heart of his own brotherhood. There was only one way Eric Christensen was headed, straight up the mountain, guns blazing, command or no command. Inside the MH-47, the men of the 160th SOAR waited quietly, as they had done so many times before, on these hair-raising air rescue ops, often at night. They were led by a terrific man, Major Stephen Reich of Connecticut, and Chief Warrant Officers Chris Schreckenberg of Jacksonville, Florida, and Corey J. Goodnature of Clarks Grove, Minnesota. Master Sergeant James W. Ponder was there, with Sergeants First Class Marcus Morales of Shelbyville, Indiana, and Mike Russell of Stafford, Virginia. Their group was completed by Staff Sergeant Seamus Gore of Danville, Ohio, and Sergeant Kip Jacoby of Pompano Beach, Florida. By any standards, it was a crack Army fighting force. The MH-47 took off and headed over the 2 mountain ranges. I guess it seemed to take forever. Those kind of rescues always do. It came in to land just about the same spot we had fast roped in at the start of this mission, around 5 miles from where I was now positioned. The plan was for the rescue team to rope down in just the same, and when the 30 seconds call came, I guess the lead guys edged toward the stern ramp. What no one knew was that the Taliban had some kind of bunker back there, and as the MH-47 tilted back for insert and the ropes fell away for the climb down, the Taliban fired rocket-propelled grenades straight through the open ramp. It was a clean shot past the heads of the lead group and blew with a shattering blast against the fuel tanks, turning the helo into an inferno, stern and midships. Several of the guys were blown out and fell, some of them burning to their deaths from around 30 feet. They smashed into the mountainside and tumbled down. The impact was so violent, our search and rescue parties later found gun barrels snapped in half among the bodies. The helicopter pilot fought for control, unaware of the carnage behind him, but certainly aware of the raging fires around and above him. Of course, there was nothing else he could do. The big MH-47 just fell out of the sky and crashed with thunderous impact onto the mountainside, swayed, and then rolled with brutal force over and over, smashing itself into pieces on a long 200-yard downhill trail to extinction. There was nothing left except scattered debris when our guys finally got up there to investigate, and of course, no survivors. My close SDV Team 1 buddies, James, Chief Dan, and young Shane, were all gone. It was as well I did not know this as I lay there in my crevice. I'm not sure I could have coped with it. It was nothing less than a massacre. Weeks later, I broke down when I saw the photographs, mostly because it was me they were all trying to rescue. As I explained at the time, I knew nothing of this. I only knew that something had happened that caused a lot of Taliban to get very obviously excited, and as soon as I could see the aircraft flying right along the canyon in front of me, A-10s and AH-64 Apache helicopters, some of them were so close I could see the pilots. I pulled my PRC-148 radio out of my pouch and tried to make contact, but I could not speak. My throat was full of dirt, my tongue was sticking to the roof of my mouth, and I had no water. I was totally unable to transmit. But I knew I was in contact because I could hear the aircrew talking, so I fired up my emergency distress beacon on the radio and transmitted that. They picked it up, and I know they did because I could hear them plainly. Hey, you guys getting that beacon? Yeah, we got it, but no further information. Then they just flew off over my right, where I now know the MH-47 had gone down. The trouble was, the Taliban steal those radios if they can, and often use them to lure the U.S. helicopters down. I was unaware of this at the time, but it's obvious to me now. The American pilots were extremely jumpy about trying to put down in response to a U.S. beacon because they did not know who the hell was aiming that beacon, and they might get shot down. Which would have been, anyway, little comfort to me, lying there on the mountainside, only half alive, bleeding to death, and unable to walk. And now it was growing dark, and I was plainly running out of options. I guess my only chance was to attract the attention of one of the pilots, who was still flying down my canyon at pretty regular regular intervals. My radio headset had been ripped away during the fall down the mountain, but I still had the wires, and I somehow rigged up two of my chem lights, which glow when you break them in half, and fixed them to the defunct radio wires. Then I whirled this homemade slingshot around my head in kind of a luminous buzzsaw the first moment I saw a helicopter in the area. I also had an infrared strobe that I could fire up, and I had a laser on my rifle, which I took off and aimed at the regular U.S. flyby. Jesus Christ, I was a living, breathing distress signal. There's got to be someone watching these mountains. Someone's got to see me. And I was using this procedure only when I actually saw a helicopter. And soon my optimism turned outright gloom. No one was paying attention. From where I was lying, it looked like I had been abandoned for dead. By now, the sun was declining behind the mountains. I had almost all of the feeling back in my legs, and this gave me hope that I might be able to walk. And although I knew the pain might be a bit fierce, I was getting dangerously thirsty. I could not get the clogged dust and dirt out of my throat, and it was all I could do to breathe, never mind speak. I had to find water. I had to get the hell out of this death trap. But not until the veil of darkness fell over the mountains. I knew I had to get myself out, first to water, then to safety, because it sure as hell didn't look like anyone was going to find me. I remember Axe's final words. They still rang clearly in my mind. You stay alive, Marcus, and tell Cindy I love her. For Axe and for Danny, and above all for Mikey, I knew I must stay alive. I saw that last long ray of mountain sun cast their gigantic shadows through the canyon before me, and just as certainly I saw the glint of a silver barrel of an AK-47 right across from me, dead ahead, on the far cliff face, maybe 150 yards. It caught the rays of dying sun twice, which suggested the son of a bitch was holding it, was making a sweep across the wall of my mountain, right past the crevice inside of which I was still lying motionless. And now I could see the tribesman in question. He was just standing there, his shirt sleeves rolled up, wearing a blue and white checkered vest, holding his rifle in a familiar low-slung grip the Afghans, a split second short of raising it into firing position. The only conclusion was he was looking for me. I did not know how many of his buddies were within shouting range, but I did know if he got a clear sight of the canyon and somehow spotted me, I was essentially history. He could hardly miss, and he kept staring across, but he did not raise his rifle, yet. I decided this was not a risk I was prepared to take. My own rifle was loaded and suppressed. There would be little noise to attract anyone else's attention, and very carefully, hardly daring to breathe, I raised my Mark 12 into firing position and drew down on the little man on the far ridge. He was bang in the crosshairs of my telescopic sight. I squeezed the trigger and hit him straight between the eyes. I just had time to see the blood boom out of the center of his forehead, and then I watched him topple over the edge, down into the canyon. He must have fallen 200 feet, screaming with his dying breath all the way. And I was not in any way moved, except, thank God, there was one less. Almost immediately, two of his colleagues ran into the precise spot where he had been standing, directly across from me. They were dressed more or less the same, except for the different colors of their vests. They stood there staring down into the canyon where the first man had fallen. They both carried AKs, held in firing position, but not fully raised. I thought they might just take off, but they stood there, now looking hard across the void, which separated my mountain from theirs. And from where I was, they seemed to be looking right at me, scanning the cliff face for any sign of movement. I knew they had no idea their pal had been shot, simply fallen, or perhaps committed suicide. However, I think option one was their instinct, and right now they were trying to find out precisely who had shot him. I remained motionless, but those little black eyes were looking straight at me, and I realized if they both opened fire at once on my rocky readout, the chances of an AK-47 bullet or bullets hitting me were good to excellent. They had to go, both of them. Once more, I slowly raised my rifle and drew a bead on the armed Taliban tribesman. The first shot killed the one on the right instantly, and I watched him tumble over the edge. The second one, understanding now there was an enemy at large, raised his gun and scanned the cliff face, where I was still flat on my back. I hit him straight in the chest, and I fired a second time in case he was still breathing and able to cry out. He fell forward without a sound and went to join his two buddies on the canyon floor, which left me alone and thus far undiscovered. Just a few hours previously, Mike Murphy and I had made the military judgment which cost 3 lives, the lives of some best SEALs I ever met. Lying here on my ledge, surrounded on all sides by hostile Taliban warriors, I could not afford another mistake. I had somehow, by the grace of God, been spared from the consequences of the first one, maybe made way up there on the granite outcrop, which ought to be named for Mikey, our superb leader. The battle for Murphy's Ridge. Every decision I made from now on would involve my own life or death. I needed to fight my way out, and I did not give a damn how many of the Taliban enemies I had to kill in order to achieve this. The key point was, I could not make another mistake. I could take no chances. The far side of the canyon remained silent as the sun disappeared behind the high western peaks of the Hindu Kush. I figured the Taliban had probably split their search party in the particular area, and I had gotten rid of one half. Out there somewhere in the deathly silence of the twilight, there would almost certainly be three more, looking for one surviving American from the original four-man platoon that had inflicted such damage on their troops. The friendly clatter of U.S. Apaches had now gone. No one was looking for me, and by far my biggest problem was water. Aside from the fact that I was still bleeding and I couldn't stand up, the thirst was becoming desperate. My tongue was still clogged with dust and dirt, and I still could not speak. I'd lost my water bottle on the mountain during the first crashing fall with Mikey, and now it had been 9 hours since I had a drink. Also, I was still soaking wet from when I fell in the river. I understood I was very lightheaded from the loss of blood, but I still tried to concentrate. And one conclusion I reached was that I had to stand up. If a couple of those Taliban came out of the corner of my left, the only way to approach me, they had any form of light, I'd be like a jackrabbit caught in someone's headlights. My redoubt served me well, but I had to get out of it right now. When the bodies of those three guys were found at first light, the mountain would be swarming with Taliban. I dragged myself to my feet and stood there in my boxers in the freezing cold mountain air. I tested my right leg, not too bad. Then I tested my left, and it hurt like the devil. I tried to brush some of the shale and dirt away from where I packed the wound, but the shards of shrapnel were jutting out of my thigh, and every time I touched one, I nearly jumped through the ceiling. At least I would have if there'd been one. One of my main problems was that I had to handle the terrain. Of course, I knew the mountain reared up behind me and that I was trapped on a cliff face with no way to go except up, which from where I stood almost unable to hobble, was a seriously daunting task. I tested my left leg again, and at least it wasn't worse. But my back hurt like hell. I never realized how much pain 3 cracked vertebrae could inflict on a guy. Of course, I never realized I had 3 cracked vertebrae either. I could move my right shoulder despite the torn rotator cuff, which I also didn't realize I had, and my broken nose sobbed a bit, which is kid stuff compared with the rest. I knew one side of my face was shredded by the fall of the mountain, and the big cut on my forehead was pretty sore. But my overriding thought was my thirst. I was only slightly comforted by the closeness of several mountain streams up here. I had to find one, fast, both to clean my wounds and to drink. The way I had shot yelling through the radio. That way, I had a shot at yelling through the radio and locating an American helicopter or fighter aircraft in the morning. I gathered up my gear, radio and strobes and laser, and repacked them in my pouch. I checked my rifle, which was about 20 rounds left in the magazine, and I had a full magazine remaining in the harness I still wore across my chest. Then I stepped out of my redoubt into the absolute pitch black and deathly silence of the Hindu Kush. There was no moon, and it was just starting to rain, which meant there wasn't going to be any moon in the foreseeable future. I tested the leg again. It held my weight without giving way. I felt my direction around the huge rock, which had been guarding my left flank all day, and then, with the smallest, most timid strides I had ever taken, I stepped out onto the mountain.